Okay, so let's start the session. So first of all, Jeffrey, thanks a lot for joining today. It's highly appreciated. For people paying attention to the description of the meetup that I'm using, it said originally Douglas and Jeffrey. Douglas had some private things that he needed to give priority, and that makes sense. But luckily, if you write a book with multiple authors, then you have something to choose. So we still have Jeffrey here, and that's awesome. So once again, Jeffrey, thanks a lot for joining. I'm gonna share my screen for a moment. And this is the flow that I have in mind. The opening is what we're doing right now. And actually, I'm quickly gonna stop and just mute all so that we don't have any background noise. You can always unmute yourself, so that's no problem. And again, just going to share. This is the flow what I have in mind. Opening is what I'm doing right now. Maybe just Jeffrey can give a quick introduction about himself, and well, I'll leave it up to you, Jeffrey, if you also want to talk about Douglas. Then we'll do a roughly 10-minute introduction to the book. After that, a breakout room moment where in small groups you can define your question that you have for Jeffrey. We'll roughly take 30 minutes to see if we can figure out an answer that makes sense, and then we'll wrap it up. If you like, you can hang around for the 15-minute debrief. That is, well, if you want to join Jeffrey, feel free to join, of course, but if you marked 1 hour sharp in your calendar, then that's something that I also want to respect. Let's start over here. So Jeffrey, can you maybe give a quick intro about yourself and optionally Douglas as well?
Sure. So I'll do this in kind of 2 parts for myself. What I do currently is I have a somewhat ambiguous role at a very large company. It's called Group Product Manager, which really has me managing and coaching a bunch of different people, which I really enjoy. I do that job 4 days a week, and then the other day I do coaching and consulting, which is working typically with executive teams and a lot of times with new executive leaders who need help growing into that larger, higher impact role. If I look historically, I would say the story is really, I've been a very long time Agile person. In the sense I started reading about Agile before the Agile Manifesto, back before the term was coined. And I got fortunate enough to get involved with the C2 wiki, which some people will recognize as the original wiki from Ward Cunningham. And there was this really neat community in the late 90s of people trying to figure out, they come across these better ways of doing software, and we're sharing their ideas and a lot of cross-pollination. And a lot of those people end up being the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, and kind of that was the very early days of Agile. So I've been a really long time Agile software person. Next thing of note probably was I got involved in the early days of Cruise Control, which was the first continuous integration server, and that was back in 2001. And then I ended up with the co-founder of the project, Paul Julius. We ended up starting a conference called KitCon, the Continuous Integration and Testing Conference. And Barry, I think you'll, as a liberating structures person, will appreciate it's an open space conference. And so I've been involved in open space type stuff since 2006, and that conference still goes on, and we'll be having it again this year for the, I don't know, 30th event or something like that. This kind of history is relevant because it was in 2006 that I met Douglas Squirrel. He was CTO of a small software company in London, and came to the conference to try to find better ways of making software. And he got really part of the community, and he's been going to KitCon ever since. And so he and I knew each other then until about, and then in 2011, I moved to London. I planned to move to Europe. I emailed a couple contacts, including Squirrel, said, thinking about moving. And so he and I worked together briefly at this small software company, which was called Tim Group. So we overlapped there briefly. It actually, I'm going to point out a different book here from IT Revolution, just published, was A Radical Enterprise by Matt Parker. And actually some of the Tim group there shows up in the book. It's kind of relevant because the this describes how we became a self-managed company, and the conversations were a big part of that. So the book Agile Conversations came about as Squirrel and I were learning this conversational techniques. I was applying them at Tim. He moved on to become a consultant. Squirrel has worked with something like since 2012, he's worked with something like 200 or 300 different companies, because he tends to work with very short, high impact engagements to help make them radically profitable. That's kind of his tagline. And then he and I have been in contact all throughout that, comparing notes on his consulting, talking about the conversational stuff, what I was doing internally. And then we also do, pair coaching and pair consulting. So we've really been partners, not just in the book, but also in coming up with different techniques. We also have a podcast called Troubleshooting Agile. And we started that because Troubleshooting Agile was originally going to be one of the draft names for the book. So that we've been doing that since, I think, 2019. And yeah, that's it's been a great experience working with Squirrel, and we've had lots of opportunity to test our ideas in, like I said, literally hundreds of different organizations. And yeah, that's what the book recommends, what we knew as of early 2020.
Nice. So I think we're already very smoothly transitioning to the next step, which is maybe just an overview of the book itself. And I'll confess that the tagline was the reason for me to buy the book.
Fantastic.
So I think a lot of people, maybe even most people that join this session, are familiar with liberating structures. And the essence of liberating structures is actually that tagline, like transform your conversation, and as such you can transform your culture. So I was very curious to see what perspective this book was going to offer, and I was not disappointed. So that's good.
I'm glad to hear it. It's actually on this. I'll talk a little bit about the book, but also talk a little bit kind of the challenges that went into this. And one of the questions was, well, what to call the book? I think, as I said, one of the draft titles we had was Troubleshooting Agile, and it partially was in coming up with the name of the book and the tagline was trying to figure out what was a message that would resonate with the people who we thought would value the book. And we very much were focused on, there are people out there who we think are having problems and who are struggling in different ways and are looking for the material that we have, or they would value the material we have, but they don't know it, right? They don't understand how conversations could help them. And so how do we identify these people? How could help these people self-identify as like, oh, this would be relevant to me? And we decided to go with Agile Conversations as the way. Now we consider different titles here. Some people and Agile has become also a dirty word in some circles. People think of Agile as they think about things like less or something like that, or the scaled Agile framework, and they're like, oh, Agile, that's that old thing. That's like that's now the institution that we're rebelling against. But the reason we went with this title was that I still think there are quite a number of people who are trying to bring in the principles of Agile, even if they don't call it that. They might say, no, we're doing lean, or we're doing DevOps. But there's a commonality that they're trying to make change, and they're frustrated by why their attempts to make change don't work. And so that was really what led to this. And really this common part here is that they're trying to transform the culture. They know that cultural transformation is part of the change they want to make, but they don't know how to do it. And that's the problem, is people would say like, well, yeah, all you need to do is change your culture. But actually, that's really hard. I mean, it's one of those things where people get stuck because people usually talk about how difficult culture change is. I actually think it's not that hard. And this is kind of the point of the book. It's actually not that difficult. The problem is that people don't have a good sense of what culture is. And I look at culture as being like the sum of all the practices that give you the dynamics that you have in your organization. It's all you relate to each other is really what your culture is. and how we relate to each other really comes down to, the kind of conversations we have. So that's what's behind the tagline. And I'm also a fan of liberating structures. So I didn't have those in mind when I was coming up with the tagline, but that's definitely how we got there, with the idea that when you change the dynamics between people, when you change those conversations, then you end up with it in a very different place, in a very different culture.
Yeah. But in short, you could say liberating structures are about making sure that everyone is heard, seen and respected, so that all voices are heard, that everyone is included with decision making, included with like if they have an opinion about something, etc. So I think if
that's true. That's true. But it's true, but I want to say that to me, it's for me, when I think about the liberating structures, because when I hear you say that, I think like it's about liberating people to speak. But for me, it's about liberating the energy, the potential energy between the people.
Yeah.
And I focus on that because I focus on what's the dynamic outcome as opposed to the structural process. It's true, like if we want to get to all the energy, then everyone needs to speak.
Yeah.
But if everyone speaks, but still things are constrained, if people don't feel like it's safe to speak, if they don't feel like people are really listening, you could still have what looks like a checkbox. We have all the participation, but if you haven't liberated the energy, then you didn't get the value of the structure. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
This distinction between structure and dynamics is one that's really important to me. So anyway, that's maybe a side rant there.
No, that's totally fine. I see Marcelo raised his hand, and I'm actually totally fine to already discuss some questions right now. So
yes,
Marcelo,
I just want. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
I just want to build a bit on what you're saying. Just a quick note, because I researched, because entering the meetup, I researched the etymology of conversation, because it comes from Latin, and it is interesting because it means meeting with someone, because it's conversari, it means with. Meet with someone. So it's interesting because it seems very fit to both the liberating structures objective and both the whole meaning of a book. So I thought it was interesting. Sorry for the.
No, that's totally fine. Thanks for sharing, Marcelo.
Yeah. So the Agile is people-driven development. Maybe Barry, you can say why you pulled this out, because as you put together this slide, what struck you about this?
So now it's going to seem like I gave you lots of thoughts to include it in the slides. Really, it was mostly like, and that's my own perspective. Sometimes Agile is being perceived as like, of course, Agile has its roots in software development, and sometimes still Agile is being perceived as something highly technical. But for me also, even if you consider it software development, it's still all about people, just about human beings, how human beings interact. In the end, it's humans that develop software. So that's always something that I put a lot of emphasis on when I work with other teams and organizations. But I never called it like people-driven development. But I think in a way, that's always how I perceived what Agile is essentially about. It's about people-driven development. So I don't know, Jeffrey, if that was also your take. That was my take, of course. I'm also curious, like what your view on this one is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the book, we kind of talk about, we kind of lay out kind of the history a bit of Agile and Lean and DevOps. And this idea of people centricity is foundational. This is why it's in chapter 1. And especially for me, because I'm graybeard. I've been doing software for a long time. I joined. So the first company I worked at was Borland, the software development tools company that's gone. But back in the mid 90s or early 90s, and I think the contrast for Agile when it came out was, I would say, that this focus on people, because what you had before that was a real focus on documentation and process. In fact, I would say that a lot of the methodologies in the 90s the anti-pattern would be documentation driven development, where there would be literally like linear shelf feet of documentation written. And and the idea was sort of like, if we could just mechanistically, check all these boxes, well, then of course things will work out. And the message of people in what became Agile was very, very different. And one of the most interesting papers for me, it was by Alistair Coburn, and he had a long time focus on human factors. In fact, his company is Humans and Technology. He wrote this paper called "People Considered First Order Nonlinear Components of Software Development," a very tongue-in-cheek title, but it basically says, look, projects succeed or fail not because of the processes they're using, not because of the methodologies they're using, not because of the tools they're using, but because of the people. Every process out there has both succeeded and failed on projects. Every tools have succeeded and failed on projects. So maybe it's worth spending more time understanding people because they're actually what makes projects and teams and organizations successful or unsuccessful. And that's really been my view for a long time. Even when I was working on things like tools, when I was working on cruise control, the reason that I worked on it was because of what it would do about the interactions between people. And Alistair and I ended up actually doing a talk together on this, because I was saying, when you have a build radiator and people know that the CI process is going to run and give feedback, they start being able to take responsibility. They relate to each other in a different way. And I would often experience when people would say, like, hey, Barry, you want to go to lunch? And Barry might say, oh, just a minute. I checked in and I want to wait until, the light grows green. We used to have a lava lamp in the office. I want to make sure that the lamp stays green. I don't want to break the build for everyone else. Tools that allowed them to take responsibility and provide some level of care for each other. It was like an enabling technology. And so the focus wasn't the tool, it was what it allowed people to do with and for each other. So people very, very centric for kind of my whole career, ever since I kind of got into this and started reading about methodologies, the people focus has always been important.
Yeah.
Maybe if we go to the next slide, if we move on to the Cynefin slide, I understand that people here you suggested would
I think it's fair to assume that people know Cynefin. So
this is a topic that's come up before. You've mentioned Cynefin in the past.
Maybe not during my meetups, but when I roughly scan the people that participate, and I know the majority of them, then I think it's just fair to assume that they know Cynefin. And if not, we'll notice by the questions that we'll probably raise after the explanation.
Okay, great. So Cynefin, again, is something I've been exposed to for a long time and really been a fan of. And it's for people who don't know, I'll just say that Cynefin divides problems into 5 domains, and those are obvious, complicated, complex, and chaotic, or undefined. That's that center area. Is like there's some places you're not sure what problem you're dealing with, now the thing is that, well, I'll just explain what each of these are, and I know the terminology has changed, so this is not the latest Cynefin language, but you can map this onto what they do today. The concepts are still the same. So obvious are things that you look at and the answer is obvious. So sort of typical or very common problems. Complicated problems are the domain of the expert. They're things that you look at and the answer is not obvious. So you need to bring an expert in who can study the system and come back. And the key thing here in both obvious and complicated is there's a right answer, and maybe multiple right answers, but there are right answers that you can know in advance. But not all problems are like that. And in particular, you get to the complex problems where it's unfortunate here that they call it chaotic as the other domain, because I think of complex as being actually the domain of like the book Chaos and Chaos Theory. It's about emergent behavior. And one of the things about the complex domain or emergent problems is that they have they have this unpredictable element. Not that what's going to happen is random, but that you simply can't gather enough information to be able to make an accurate prediction. If you could have all the information, you could predict them, but in practice, it's not possible. And the obvious example is the weather. If you believe in a mechanistic universe, if we knew every state of every atom and how everything was moving, you could predict the weather infinitely out in the future. But in practice, we don't know enough level of detail to be able to model the system perfectly. And so instead, our forecasts tend to devolve, and long-term forecasting isn't possible. And that's kind of about this problem. Now, things make sense after the fact. They have things called retrospective coherence. After something happens, you can look back and say, this is why it happened, but you can't always, but you can't predict. Chaotic problems are one where there's no obvious connection between what happens, actions and response. But the juicy area here is complex. And the thing is that my view is that humans are complex systems. We are by our nature complex actors. So when we are dealing with any system involving humans, we're dealing with a complex situation. And so how do you navigate a complex scenario? And Cynefin gives the answer. It says you should probe, sense, respond, meaning you kind of run little experiments. You need to kind of learn empirically what's going to happen, and respond to things as they come up. You need to be because you can't predict. You have to be testing and responding and expect to have this kind of feedback loop. And when we come together in a conversation, we come together in a meeting, that conversation is how we do that. It's how we probe and sense what's going on with other people. It's how we learn what's in other people's heads, those things that we can't predict. And the problem, one of the problems that organizations have, is the people don't respect each other as essentially complex entities, and they think of them as simple or at best complicated, as though if I just study this person enough as an expert, I'll be able to predict. I'll know what they know, and if I can predict what they're going to do, well then I don't need to learn from them. There's no surprises. But that's not true. The value of having teamwork is that we can't always predict what other people know and what they believe, and the value comes from the surprises we get in dealing with other people. And good conversations respect that. Real conversations are about probing and sensing, responding between individuals. Those are the dynamics that you need. So this is kind of almost like a theoretical basis for what we come to in the rest of the book.
So before we move on, if anyone that is listening right now at this point has a question that he or she would like to have clarified, feel free to raise your hand. It would be a shame if we leave people totally confused for the rest of the meeting. Yeah, Richard?
Yeah, I haven't read the book, so disclaimer. I'm just wondering, do you treat within the book non-verbal, non-linguistic aspects of conversations as well?
No, we don't. It's a good point. I mean, well, I'll say this mildly, not in the way that you're probably meaning, which is sort of subtle nonverbal. We do cover a case, for example, where someone stands up or leaves the room. So sort of gross, large-scale actions would fit into the format we put in there. But we don't cover any of the sort of more subtle things. And there's an extent to which that's sort of deliberate, in that for most people, they're going to be guessing what that would mean. Now, we'll talk in a moment about the kind of framework we use for people to practice. So things that you notice, you absolutely could put down, but we're not trying to train people to look for certain cues. We're training for people to sort of take their thoughts and feelings and verbalize them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking also of, that any conversation, usually there's an aspect of invitation to it, and there's a sort of aspect of what's the physical space that you're being invited into, and
yes,
that sort of thing.
Yes, and there's great things about that, but we're at a more basic level here, which is, I think, where many people could let's get the foundations right first, and then you can become
quite enough to chew on in this space.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Good question, Richard. Any other questions that are relevant at this point in time? Okay, so let's move on to the 4 R's.
Yeah, so now the book is really organized around a methodology, and this is something that we came up with from a few different places. We in studying conversations, there's kind of a academic tradition that we're plugged into, which is Chris Argyris and disciples. So people might know, are more likely to know, instead of Chris Argyris, they're more likely to know Peter Senge, and was it learning the 5th discipline. So he's actually was a student of Chris Argyris, and so we're very much tapping into an existing academic tradition. But we also looked at, and we're studying conversations in the context of therapy. And I was looking at different methodologies of how people would talk about different types of therapy. So this includes things like motivational interviewing, includes CBT. I listened to a lot of the Dr. David Burns' Feeling Good podcast. There's Dr. Xavier Amador and what he calls the LEAP method. And in learning and using these types of methods, we found like there was a commonality. And what we tried to do then with the 4 R's was to capture the commonality and to prescribe some steps for people to follow of how they could go about learning from the conversations that they're having and improving their conversations. So that's kind of where this came from. And what we came up with is a set of steps that we hope that people will use in applying what they learned from the book. And that's the idea, is that this is a practical go apply it, and the methodology revolves around actually writing stuff out on paper. Now, you can do it not on paper, you can do it in paper or electronically, but the heart of it is you need to get what's happening out of your head. If you're familiar with, and I'll just say a moment here, people might be familiar with cognitive biases. I'll say this basically, it's the reason that we tell people you need to get this out of your head and on paper is that while it's in your head, your cognitive biases will prevent you from seeing what's really happening in the conversation. And this is kind of the heart of it. We have lack of skill in conversations because we can't see our mistakes. It's very different if I'm learning a physical skill like water skiing. If I'm water skiing and I make a mistake, I fall in the water, and there's no ambiguity of did I make a mistake. Or if I'm snow skiing, I fall down. If I'm playing tennis, the ball goes in the net. I get feedback on what I'm doing. In our conversations, we generally don't get very good feedback, and even more surprisingly, we're not even able to see what we are doing. This is the hard, extreme version of it. I'll put it this way: you don't know what you say in a conversation. What you perceive in the conversation is what the other person says, but when you speak, you don't hear the words, you hear your intention. So when you're in a conversation, you're only seeing half of it. You're seeing what you're hearing in your mind, what you intend, and when the other person is, you're not hearing what they intend, you're hearing what they say. So there's actually like two different conversations going on. And the heart of this method here is to try to get more concrete about what is actually being said and how it's different than what your thoughts and feelings are. And then once you have that record, and we do it like this, you take a piece of paper, you fold it in half, and then you write out on the right-hand side the actual words that were said, as far as you can remember. So this, you write this out like a screenplay. I said this, Barry said that, Marcelo said this, I replied this way. You have the conversation. And then on the left-hand side, you put the inner thoughts and feelings. So what you're thinking and feeling while the conversation's happening. Now, for the other question about nonverbal, if you notice something and it enters your consciousness and you react to it, then you would put it on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is for anything in the visible world. This is something that a video camera would capture. And the left hand is for the invisible world. It's for what you're thinking and feeling. But be clear, only what you're thinking and feeling. You're not allowed to speculate for other people unless you're a telepath. But then if you are, you knew I was going to say that. So this is the heart of it, is like getting stuff down on paper. And now it's like you can actually see what you're saying in the conversation for the first time. So we talk about in these 4 R's, every level gives you a chance for different aha moments. And so often we do a workshop, people will do this and they just write it out and they're like, oh, just from that, I can't, oh, well, of course this didn't work. Look what I said. And it's strange because it's unintuitive that people would have had this, they know what they said in their head, but it doesn't really sink in until you get it out of your head. So anyway, having done this, you then reflect on the conversation, and the book is really organized for different types of reflections, but you can go through and mark things up. And the examples here of looking for curiosity and transparent, those are kind of very common. Those are like a foundational elements of good conversations. But there's also other elements we have to reflect on in the book. And then the idea is you go through and practice, you revise. And this revision is really important. This is where you actually start building the muscles. This is where you build the skill, is to actually write out, like, well, what might I have said differently that would have been more skillful? And ideally, you have someone around that you can role play with, and you can practice saying those words, because often the things we write look great on paper, and then we try to say them and we go, no, I don't talk that way. No one talks that way. Okay, back, revise again. And then if even better, you have someone who can say your words back to you. And sometimes what we like saying to someone else, we don't like hearing. So this is the idea, is we have this very practical thing that you can do in a relatively short period of time. You can do this in 15 minutes. You can analyze a conversation. That's the heart, is getting into being able to not just think about conversations, but to practice them, because it's only through practice that we build skill. So that's that idea of building the skill is the message of the book. And then we have different types of conversations.
Jeffrey, so one of the liberating structures I use a lot is called what, so what, now what, and it's based on, what is it called, the ladder of inference. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, ladder of inference. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that? I think it's also in your book, right?
It is, yes. Ladder of inference is one of those. It's actually one of the things that created by Chris Argyris, who I mentioned earlier. So it's very much one of his tools. So ladder of inference basically is how we go from stimulus to response. It's like how we go from hearing something or seeing something in the world. We observe data, and then from there we make meaning from it. And we add assumptions and inferences, and that's why the ladder. And then we get to beliefs about the world, and finally our actions. And normally this kind of, these stages in between are invisible to us. We tend to mistake our inferences about reality with reality, right? And this separates, no, let's go back. What was the data that you actually saw, as opposed to the meaning you made from it? Because understand, other people, might have seen different things, they might have different data, but even if they have the same data, they might have had different meaning they made from it.
And recording your conversation, is that the first step then? Like writing down the data, the things that you really heard?
Yes, absolutely. And reconstructing the conversation is where we start, is to write that down. And then later we can go ahead and apply something like the ladder of inference. So that's one of the tools we introduce in chapter 3. We introduce the ladder of inference.
Oh, excellent. Okay, shall I move on, Jeffrey? To the,
yeah, let's go to the next one. So the book, as I said, we have different tools that we give, and we give 5 different sets of tools that go with 5 different conversations. Actually, we get 6 sets of tools, but for 5 conversations. And you had the idea of that maybe there was a 6th conversation. Do you want to mention what you had in mind there?
Yeah, I was listening. There's also a podcast episode from the Agile Book Club. And in that podcast episode that I was listening to a couple of days ago, I think you actually mentioned, like, well, you could say that there's also a 6th conversation, which is about transparency and curiosity.
Yeah. So we in the 5 conversations we have in mind, we lay out, like, there's particular conversations to have between people, but the transparency and curiosity, I don't think of it as a different type of conversation, but rather it's foundational. A good conversation is one where we learn. And in fact, there's some of Argyris's disciples talked about what they call a mutual learning conversation. And this is, I really like this framing, because one of the things it says is we come together for a conversation, and maybe there's something we're trying to agree on. There's no guarantee that we 2 humans can come to an agreement on any given topic. I mean, maybe we can, maybe we can't. So we should not, I think, aim for agreement as the goal of a conversation. But I think what we can aim for is mutual learning. Even if we disagree, I can still learn what it is that you believe and why you believe it. You can learn what I believe and why I believe it. So we can learn about our differences. That should always be achievable. But to do that requires transparency and curiosity. I have to be willing to share what it is that I know. I have to be willing to share what it is that I believe. I have to know how to do that, which actually is harder than it sounds. And I also need to be curious. I need to care about your transparency. I need to care what it is that you're thinking and feeling. And it's kind of like transparency and curiosity for me are like that, without which no. Meaning, if you're not willing to be transparent or curious, then none of these other conversations are possible.
I think one of the things you mentioned in the book for curiosity is to ask genuine questions. Yes. And I think something I need to confess, like, so far, I've been very good in asking questions that are not really genuine, like more like leading questions in a way.
Well, it's a good point. Genuine questions are actually something that people often struggle with when we come, because one of the things we do in the workshop is what people look at your questions now, how many of them were genuine. And the people are like a bit confused. Well, what do you mean by genuine questions? And I have a technical definition of it, a very precise definition, a functional definition, which is your question only expresses genuine curiosity if the answer might change your mind about something. And that's something that often is people struggle with a bit, because they'll say, like, well, what about this example? I asked this question, I really wanted to know the answer. I was really curious. And that might be an example like, but what they don't understand is that what they're asking is actually kind of a transactional question. So I'll ask you one here. So Barry, what's your favorite type of food? If we were to go out for lunch, what kind of food do you like to go to?
I don't know. Spaghetti.
Okay. All right. So good news. I know a great Italian place. Okay. So here's the thing. I asked a question where I didn't know the answer to. I didn't know what Barry's answer was going to be. And I wanted to know. But why did I want to know? Well, because I'm hoping to take Barry to lunch and convince him to do something that I want done. And so what I'm asking is a question to understand what his beliefs are so that I can get my way, right? I have a strategy in mind, and I'm gathering information to execute the strategy that I have in mind. So I'm curious about the data, but what's not a question is my strategy, right? And I'm not really open to changing my mind that my strategy is the right one. So my question in that sense was not genuine curiosity. Instead, I would have to be asking a question that goes to the heart of what I'm actually trying to do. So instead, if it was sort of, I was trying to convince you to have Matt Parker on your podcast, I would have to ask a question that was more related to that. Like, and ideally I'd combine this with transparency. Hey, Barry, I'm just thinking that it'd be great for you to have Matt on, the author of Radical Enterprise. It seems to fit well with your audience here. But I don't know. Maybe there's a reason why you wouldn't want to have too many authors on, or you don't want to do too many books. What are your thoughts? How do you view having more authors on? Right. And now I might get answers from Barry that says, no, I have a limit of 2 authors a year, and you and Squirrel were it, or I only want 1 book a year. I don't know what it is, but I might actually end up changing my mind and say, oh, well, given that, yeah, no, you shouldn't do it. And that's what makes a genuine question. But it becomes one of those things that people struggle with. But these I think are core skills that apply across all the conversations. And then the conversations we lay out, some people might see a certain analogy between these and the 5 dysfunctions of a team, the book by Patrick Lencioni. And there's some relationship here, because we were saying that these are 5 conversations you need to be able to have a high-performing organization, right? If your organization can't build trust, well, then you'll never be able to talk about fear and what holds you back. And you need to understand these things before you can talk about why, building a shared goal. And you need to have that before you can have people be committed towards achieving that goal. And you need that commitment before you're able to hold each other accountable. And not just, I say hold each other accountable, really, but to actually be wanting to provide accountability. We have a view of people should want to be accountable, and they will if they're committed. So this is, in a sense, there's kind of a ladder that you get to through these 5 conversations.
But it's interesting that why is in the middle. There's a book called, I think the title is Start With Why.
Simon Sinek.
I think, and then also within our community, we're almost like trained that always starts with why. and it's in the middle over here. So can you maybe explain why? Because I guess, again, not a genuine question, but it's a conscious decision to put it on the 3rd place.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the reason is that you want to be able to have that conversation be productive. And there's the precursors to having a productive conversation in a group would be that they already have trust. And there's a quote from the early days of Agile, which was, the first thing to build is trust, right? So people on a team, they go out to build software. It's like, well, before you can build the software, you have to build trust among the members. And that's kind of our view here is starting to build that trust between individuals allows for a genuine productive conversation. We talked earlier about, liberating structures. We made a reference to it. And I got very excited about, like, you're trying to liberate the energy in the room. And that's kind of how I look at this also. It's trust is what allows people to be vulnerable. Trust is, and actually it works both ways. You only build trust by being vulnerable, and having trust allows more vulnerability, which builds more trust. There's a feedback cycle here. And so building that trust is really key to be able to have the productive conversations later. Otherwise, the energy in the room won't be liberated. People's voices won't be liberated. And that's why we start with trust. And then from there we go to fear, because this is something that often is hard for people to speak and talk about. What are the challenges that we see in the organization? What's going to prevent us from achieving our hopes and dreams? We think that bringing those out is a better foundation before you start getting into the, looking positively to the future. So it's kind of an empirical formula that we found works better than starting with why with people who are very, very skeptical.
That makes sense. Makes sense. So do you want to move to the next slide to do? Yeah. And maybe are there any questions about this slide at this point about what Jeffrey has been talking about so far? Again, if so, feel free to just raise your hand or put your question in the chat. Yeah, you can also clap. That's up to us. Tilman, go ahead.
I have a question on maybe how you see the relationship, because what I sort of sense is when you have a team working, like I work as a Scrum Master with teams. So usually what is there is actually, yes, you do start with also working on the product, and you, I mean, I think that's useful, not to kind of in the empty space try to create some trust, but I think trust comes when you really work on something, and then you already have some commitments, and you have already some why and some, you know, some basic accountabilities even, I guess. So for me, it seems like everything is in place, and still focus more on the trust in the beginning, and then sort of have a sort of a more loose standpoint maybe on the rest, and then move up the ladder to increasingly refine commitments and why and so on. So is that picture that I have in my mind resonate, or do you see it different?
Well, let me test. One thing that I heard you say was that you think it's, you know, in the context, it's good to get people together and building something, and then that will build trust as an effect. Is that right? That trust will come out as they build something, or?
Yeah, I think if you do something, then I think that's more concrete. Like if you just talk about trust and so on, that can be very empty. But if you really do something and make a real mistake, I think then much more trust can be built. If you like say, yeah, we're trying to build something, it was an actual failure, or then I think real trust conversations can take place. But if you just do it in a workshop before even starting to code, people will, in my, I don't know, my perception, not trust, and they will like think, well, can we get away from this empty talk about trust and move to to doing stuff?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm a big believer in it depends. Like everything is situational specific. So some, you know, and what I could say is that I think you're right. Some teams, when you bring them together and say, let's talk about trust, they would be rolling eyes. Now, actually, I think that would give you a lot to talk about in the room. And some teams might not need it. One of the things I've thought about this is that if you think about what people say often about Agile, you know, especially in the early days, they would be pretty prescriptive. Like you want to get the whole team together, you know, in the same space. You want to have like the team room, or, you know, get all their desks together, and it's kind of like shoved people together to start working together. And the reason that was successful is that there's an element to which we're describing, which is humans want to do this. Like humans want to build trust with each other. They want to be successful. And there's an element to which these things will start happening naturally, can happen naturally, when you have people in a team and trying to work towards shared goals. But the thing is, in my experience, that these things may break down. They might. So if you want to be able to be equipped for all situations, then it's useful to have a model to be applying. And so we put out here is kind of a model of these 5 conversations. And then to be able to, when you have the ability to have them all, when you understand the purpose of each of them, then you can kind of choose what's relevant based on your actual situation. So, you know, if the place that you start with the team is, let's talk about what we're going to build, that's fine to start. I think you really, one of the things I also believe is you can start anywhere. So, you know, in particular, you're going to start where you are. and for a lot of people, that means you're not starting on a new project, you're starting on a project that's in flight. And so one element is like to be able to say like, okay, well, where are we on trust, and how could we start having a trust conversation about what we've been doing together? So in that sense, I agree with you that you'll often have productive conversations because of your shared history up to that point. I think you can also start it at a new project. And I think it'd be the kind of thing where, given my approach about transparency and curiosity, I might even start by sharing this model and say, you know, I have this model, it might not be right, but it seems worth doing. Like, here's my belief is that we should be able to have these conversations with each other. And, you know, how do people feel like current level of trust, you know, both with each other and within the org? That might be a really interesting way to start a conversation. So I agree with your idea that the actual concrete things can be more juicy and give you more to work with. But I also think you can start anywhere.
Okay, thank you for the response.
So let's go to, I think this is the next slide, yeah. So the 5 conversations that you.
By the way, I see a question. I see a question in the chat that I wanted to point out, which is, can I get started with conversation analysis? How can I get started? How can I make it a habit? Well, there's a webinar that we did. Well, you can look for talks by Squirrel and I. Look for anything called like frustrated, it might be your fault, and even like how to do it as a group is this link at IT Revolution about having a conversational dojo. I think one of the best ways to get started is do it with other people, and that's what the conversational dojo is about. But if you want the fundamental skills, you can also look for that. Our talk on frustrated, it might be your fault, and we lay out the steps of how to do it, how to lay out the 4 R's and walk through them in the basic case of transparency and curiosity. The actual steps of the trust conversation, fear conversation, and so on, those are in the book, and we haven't done as many on those. But that sort of foundational conversational analysis, you can do it all the time. There's also I run a meetup where we have monthly meetups where we do a dojo as a group. So the Agile Conversations meetup.
And you do that online, Jeffrey?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I did not read the book fully. I'm halfway the trust chapter, and you write somewhere, you and your co-author, of course, you write that it's quite a lot of effort. So if you want to change your conversations, you're in for a lot of work. So are you willing and able to do that? For me, it sounds very promising. So I think, yeah, I should give this a try. But I'm also thinking, it sounds like a lot of work during your conversation. So you're taking notes on how you feel and what everyone is saying, you and your partner, your conversation partner. And then you need to keep the conversation itself also going. And so there will be delay in your answers because you're taking notes. But maybe that this is something that does not happen in practice or goes away quite quickly. I don't know, but I think I have some fear there, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
No,
Follow me here.
It's very reasonable. Yeah, for sure. I will say this: when we talk about doing these conversation analysis, I'm not doing this from notes. I just do it from memory. So we usually would say is start with a conversation that you were frustrated or you think didn't go as well as it could, and then just recreate it. Now, one thing I hold up here, you can see the size of the paper; it's quite small. This it's even smaller than I like because this is US paper. I was in the UK up until August, and I would use A5 notebook for these. So you don't need a lot of space. So as I said, it really only takes about 10 or 15 minutes to do one of these, and it's not something that you need to do in the moment. So I wouldn't typically take notes to use later. I would just later say, "Oh, that didn't go very well. Let's think about why that is."
So you replay it basically in your mind, and then you take notes.
Write it out. Yeah, and people often ask. People often ask, and they say, "Oh, but I won't remember exactly what was said." I'm like, "That's fine. It doesn't matter because your memory will recreate the same problems that you had in the real conversation. The words might be different, but the problems will be the same. It's kind of like a fractal. You will tend to recreate the same things. And actually, one of the things we talk about is you can use these same techniques. You can do conversation analysis for a conversation that hasn't happened yet. You can say like, "Oh, I'm nervous about this conversation." Well, do the 4 R's analysis and then help you prepare for it.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
So what I want to do, because this was the 10-minute explanation of the book.
Yeah.
No, it was super interesting, Jeffrey. But what I want to do, I do want to respect the 1-hour time box, but I will stick around for another 15 minutes. But if you just wrote down the 1-hour time box in your agenda, then I'm just gonna quickly share some links with you, and then we can just continue for another 15 minutes. So ideally, if you like, just stick around. But I just want to show you a couple of links over there. And I think some links were already shared in the chat as well. So this is the website to Agile Conversations. The website contains a 2-minute introduction video. And of course, you can also order the book from the website. The podcast episode that I mentioned is over here from the Agile Book Club. It's also interesting to check out. And Eleonora created a visual summary. It leads you to a LinkedIn page, and then in the comments, you'll see the visual summaries by Eleonora. So just so you know. I think this could also be a moment that I'm gonna stop sharing so that we can actually see each other. Hi, everyone. Jeffrey, I'm not sure what time you had in mind. Do you need to leave or can you
No,
stick around for...
I can stay.
Oh, nice. So what I'm not going to do is the breakout room moments. We'll just stay in the main channel. That's also, well, in a way easier for the recording itself. So maybe let's just take 30 seconds of individual reflection. And if you have a question, then just put it in the chat. And I cannot promise that we'll address all the questions. I have no idea how many questions will appear, but let's see what happens. So let's just take 30 seconds, 1 minute-ish for some individual reflection. And if you have a question, then let's put it in the chat.
And also say in that, if you have any aha moments that come up, so maybe you don't have a question, but you had something that struck you as an aha moment, would love for you to put that in the chat as well.
Oh, that's a good one. Cool. Thanks for joining, Richard. Okay, so let's slowly see what appeared. Jeffrey, is it okay if I leave it up to you to pick the ones that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll start it. I'll start at the top and go through. There's a question about why I wasn't at Snowbird. I wasn't as really into those circles as much. I wasn't I was reading avidly. I didn't contribute a lot on the C2 wiki. So I was taking what I was reading and applying it. So I was, for example, trying to do unit testing in Java in 1998. And the key thing there would be like JUnit didn't exist yet. So was kind of very early in applying those and a big fan of what people were saying, but I wasn't speaking up enough to be invited. Another question here, can you give an example of walking skeletons that are not software releases? Yeah, we have a group, a company I'm at now that does data collection and coming up with their process of how they'll source some data and capture it, and doing that initially in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that to as a proof of concept, saying, okay, does this allow us to capture the data we need and get it to people? And we'll start with something in a shared Google Doc or something. And also this, I assume most commonly when I'm working with a group and they want to put structure or documents in place, they say, well, let's just start with an empty Google Doc because we can model whatever we want in text. And then later we can just figure out like if there's a schema here that should become an Excel spreadsheet or a database or something else. Well, let's just start with a document. That's my usually a walking skeleton, because probably tied to my interest in conversations. We can put whatever we want in words and then later figure out what it should be. Goen asked, does the book explain ways to create trust, to remove fears, and how to conduct the conversation to create the 5 conversations? we talk a lot about how to have the specific conversations. I think we do talk about creating trust explicitly in the fears in the trust and fear conversations. That Eleonora mentioned TDD for people, and she has a nice bit of one of her visuals about that. And that's a really a way of creating trust. I think one of the fundamental ones. There's when I also say this about in general about creating trust. If you listen to like Brene Brown and the power of vulnerability, also this in listening to Brene Brown, I got the idea that some combination of her and Amy Edmondson, that the way that you create trust is by being vulnerable. And now a lot of people take that as a fairly extreme statement, but understand being vulnerable could be sharing an opinion that you think not everyone will agree with. So being vulnerable can in a sense be a very, small, a low bar, or it can be, even being vulnerable can say, raising your hand asking, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you said. Would you be willing to repeat it? Being vulnerable can actually be what might seem like a small step, but it's being willing to expose yourself in some way. And I think that's really that we create trust when we're willing to do this. And other people, when they're able to do the same, be vulnerable and get a positive response. Obviously, if someone says, I'm sorry, I didn't understand it, can you move in to explain it? The person replies is like, well, that's a waste of time. Like, what I said was simple enough. Like, if you didn't get it, you'll never get it. Like, okay, you're not building trust there. So there's the action of being, the being vulnerable is like making an offer, and then having a positive response is accepting the offer. And it's actually that's what builds trust. But without the vulnerability element, you don't have the ability to accept it. So I think that's really foundational. The removing fears is largely about getting people to share what it is that they're feeling. So it's kind of extended vulnerability. How do we get out and be able to discuss what it is that we're feeling?
I see, Eleonora, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Maybe it's just my thoughts, but I want to check with Jeffrey because it's here. That maybe these kind of conversations are not a checklist. You say, okay, the trust conversation done, the fear conversation done, the committing conversation done.
Yeah.
What I perceive in my daily job is that they are something that you need to work on and work on and work on. Creating trust is something that I need to build daily with my team. And so it's not something that it's done and stop and finish, but things change, people change in the team. So each time I need to start again a trust conversation with everyone. So you need to work continuously on this kind of conversation. Never say, oh, I've built the trust, well done. But probably, yes, it's true for sometimes, but then you need to work again and again and again and again and move on.
I think that's true. I think there's actually something I would say that's a bit sneakier about this, which is that the tagline is, transform your conversations, transform your culture. But we could also say, transform your conversations, transform yourself. My experience is that having practiced this for a long time, especially the elements around trust, which the transparency and curiosity, it makes me a different person. So when you say I need to continually build trust, that's true. But also, as it becomes habitual, it becomes like automatic. Of course, I relate to people in a way of being authentic. Of course, I share my thoughts with people. So the quality of exchanges and conversations I have are much higher, but it's not as effortful as it might sound when you say I need to continuously do that. It's in a sense, there's an element which is like, I need to keep being a good person every day. I need to keep being a genuine human with the people I work with, which makes it is less maybe daunting than saying, well, I need to build trust all the time. But you build trust when you're authentic and genuine and sharing. So it's not as effortful, but it does take effort to get there. People read our book and they tend to fall into two camps. People say, oh, I really enjoyed your book. And then we ask them, well, did you write out conversation analysis? Did you do the exercises? And they're like, oh, no, I didn't, but I intend to. Okay. And then there's people who say, wow, your book was a lot harder than I thought. It took me a lot longer to get through than I expected. And we're like, oh, you did the exercises, didn't you? They're like, yes, they were great. But man, it was a lot more effort. And I think when we talk about this, everyone tends to agree. They're like, oh, this all makes sense. But there's the problem is people will hear this and think it makes sense. And they think because you understand then you're probably already doing it, or that you will do it. I'm saying you will not. You will not. These skills are like learning to play piano. You can listen to piano music as much as you like. You can love piano music with all your heart. That doesn't mean you can play the piano. You can understand how a piano works perfectly. You know, I hit a key, a hammer hits a string, the string vibrates, the different length strings make different sounds. I understand perfectly how a piano works. You cannot play the piano without practicing. You will not develop these skills without practicing. So that's, but when you do, what happens is you change the way you relate to people, you change the way you communicate, you change the dynamics in the room. And that laying out these conversations are to give you a sense of why you would do it, what the payoff is for doing it. But understanding that that would be the payoff, understanding how to get the payoff is not enough. You need to practice.
This would be a good moment to wrap up the session, but we've still got 5 minutes left. So
yeah, that was the big reveal.
Yeah.
But
no, excellent. So there are a couple of questions left. Maybe I think we've got time maybe for maybe one or two, depending, of course, how much time it takes. But
okay. So there's a question here from Tillman asking about the difference between accountability and commitment. I see them as being different. Commitment is like building commitment with the group that we're going to try to accomplish this. Accountability is how I come back and account for what I did. So accountability is come back and say, I did this for these reasons. Here's what I had in mind. Here's what I intended. Here's what actually happened. And that sort of like showing up an obligation to render an account is what's meant by accountability. And it's distinct and follows on from the commitment. I typically will have the willingness to be accountable because I've committed to something. Otherwise, like, why would I bother telling people about what I'm doing? It's only a commitment to building something together that leads to that behavior. Is there anyone who uses these practices with their team or colleague? Oh, I do. Hopefully other people do. Could you think of the 6 conversations as main building blocks for team agreements? What are your thoughts on that? I think you would build the team agreements from having the conversations, is what my guess would be. Is that because what you'll discover in the conversations lead to what you put in the agreement. What's the easiest path to start doing conversational analysis with Agile teams? Is start. It is like the Conversational Dojo kit. So I put a link to that webinar, lays out how to run a session, and it gives kind of a step-by-step guide of how to do it. So I would say, get at least one other person who's willing to try it with you, and then start. Let's see. Would you recommend doing conversations analysis with conversations held via Zoom or even chats? Yeah, absolutely. We've done them. We had some really great Slack conversations that we analyzed. Some of the material in the book came from a Slack conversation where the other person and I both went and analyzed what happened. So you definitely can do it with stuff that happened in Zoom or in person or email or chat. All of that's grist for the mill. And I think that was all the questions that I see.
Wow. Well, I think at the start, Eleonora mentioned something that while reading the book, it was mind-blowing for her. I think it's fair to say, well, at least for me, this was also a mind-blowing experience interview. I enjoyed it a lot. So I learned lots of many new things, Jeffrey. So highly appreciate that you wanted to contribute to this session.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. I appreciate that everyone was interested enough in the topic to spend their time on it.
Yeah. So if people have comments, feedback, questions, then feel free to unmute yourself. This is the moment that we're slowly going to wrap up the session.
Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. I'm certainly motivated to give it a try and doing it step by step. Looking into the meetup groups and what Tillman is suggesting. So awesome.
Great.
Cool. So thanks for joining, and hopefully see each other next time during a next session. And thanks again, Jeffrey. I'm just going to stop the recording right now.